You can mute yourself now. Hello and welcome to IL SciComm. A few reminders as we get started here. Please turn on your camera if you're able to. We'd love to see your face. We're hoping to have some real in-depth conversations today, and it's helpful to know who we're talking to with that. Let Twitter know that you're here using the hashtag IL SciComm. It helps build our participation. It gets people here so that we have more voices represented in these conversations. If you could, please also share your Twitter handle in the chat window. And then I will also share, you're not going to be able to click on this link, but I will share it in the chat box. The survey data is important for us to know that we're being effective and to keep us kind of on the right track to know what's useful for you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and share that link in the chat window. Maybe, no, I'm not. I'm going to maybe Janine can share that link in the chat window. I'm having a hard time. Sharing that link in the chat window, go ahead and fill out that survey. Let us know where you are now. And then we also ask that you fill that out at the end. Stick around to the end to fill that out to know if this session was useful to you. Our contact information is there, Janine, myself, and you can find more of our work at ilclassroomsinaction.org, scienceteachersinAction.org, and then on Facebook at Illinois Classrooms in Action is our Facebook page. So I am Jesse Samine, and I'm joined by Janine Shepard. We are both science content specialists and the host for ILSR each month. Our team of content specialists is employed by the Center for Educational Initiatives at Illinois State University, which partners with ISB to support teachers in Illinois with the implementation of the next generation science learning standards. So again, as we said at the beginning, if you have not already turned on your camera, please do that to make sure that we can have a fully authentic conversation. We will be encouraging you to talk during our discussions. Background noise that's distracting. There's a mute feature that Janine has probably already done for you. But if you, when it's time to talk, you can turn off your mute feature by hitting the microphone icon. It's helpful to click on gallery view to kind of see everybody's, as many faces as you can at once. And also please rename yourself to reflect who you are. To do that, if you hover over your own video and click on the three dots in the upper right-hand corner, just make sure that your name reflects who you are. A disclaimer before we start, any discussions here is not an endorsement by ISB or ISU. We are only providing a platform to share ideas and resources. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Sarah Michaels. Dr. Michaels is Professor of Education, Senior Research Scholar at the Hiatt Center for Urban Education at Clark University in Boston, Massachusetts. Much of her work centers around academically productive talk and using discourse in classrooms to promote learning. She is the co-author of the Talk Science Primer, which I mentioned because it's a resource that I recommend often, as well as Ready, Set, Science, which is the book that we are currently reading for the Illinois Science Educators Book Club. Today, she's going to help us think about how to support students in making their thinking visible in science classrooms. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Michaels, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you both for getting this going. I don't want to lecture. I mean, this whole conversation is about talk and discussion and making thinking visible. So I'm going to push in lots of ways for us to actually try to do that. As Jesse said, I've been working for very, very, very long time on the power of talk to promote learning and also to, in a sense, build a shared world, really bringing in the voices and the lives, the assets of the kids, and taking everybody to new places, new ways with worlds. And that's what I really would like to talk with you about, sort of the focus on maybe chapter 5, but I'm also happy to talk more about the issues around modeling and making thinking visible through representations, and modeling talk as well. Over the years since Ready, Set, Science, I've continued to work on these issues, and I've continued to hear from and learn from some truly amazing teachers. That's basically how I've learned everything I know. So I use my contacts, my networks with teachers all over, actually, and work to sort of bring their wisdom into the broader community. And so I want to talk a little bit during our conversation about some things that I would say I've figured out since Ready, Set, Science. Is that Kristen? So I want to add to what's been happening over the last 10 years, number one, and make that sort of building on Ready, Set, Science. And I think over the last 10 years, I've come to think about this notion of academically productive talk more as talking for understanding. And also I've come to think much, much, much more deeply about the importance of listening, both for teachers and for kids. So we can talk more about that as we jump in. But can we get started by people actually going around just a little bit and talking about who they are, where we don't have that many people, so I think it's okay to do that. Whether you're a teacher or, a coach or a curriculum developer, what grades you teach, if you're a teacher. And I'd also like people to think about whether they could identify any place in chapter 5 or 6 that was particularly helpful for them or puzzling, something they'd want to talk a little bit more about. So if people could take just a minute or two of quiet think time and then really go around with the people who are here and sort of introduce yourself to me. I hope maybe some of you know each other from past book club sessions, but also identify a part of the text that you think was particularly provocative for you, helpful, or something you'd actually like to continue talking about with the group. So Jesse, let's just say 2 minutes of quiet time. And people can write in the chat if they have a place in the text, give us the page number and a little bit about what that place is. So use the chat if you can.
I can go ahead and start because I probably had a head start on this, seeing as I have been developing some of these questions beforehand. So on page 89 and 90, it talks about kind of the traditional use of talk in the classroom. And I love the fact that it gives a label to it too, because it helps me recognize how I did that quite often, is that RE or IRE sequence of, I'm going to ask a question, the student is going to answer the question, and then I, as a teacher, either evaluate whether it's a worthy answer or not. So thinking about how do we go from that to more productive ways of talk, I'm wondering what, if I'm working with a teacher or thinking about how to do that as on my own, like what's the first step? Like what's the one small, low effort, low bar, low barrier thing that I can do to promote more productive talk in my classroom?
Yeah. Jesse, do you think it makes sense? That's a great topic.
Yeah.
So maybe we could take that on a bit and really dig in a little bit more to that IRE. And it was in Ready, Set, Science, so people have read about it a bit. But it's deep in our DNA. I mean, it's the absolute default, most common form of talk. So it sounds like discussion, but but I think it's really not. And I call it kind of recitation. Some people say it's kind of like a teacher giving a lecture, but pulling pieces of the lecture out of the mouths of the kids. And so I want to focus a little bit on that third turn, the E, the evaluation turn, because that's, I think, what everything hinges on. And it's that third turn that sort of turns everything into the game of doing school, getting the right answer. And it's what telegraphs to everyone. Some kids are smarter and some kids are less smart. And even if teachers evaluate positively, great, oh, I love that idea. That still creates the kind of right-wrong culture that makes a lot of people, a lot of kids, and a lot of adults reluctant to participate. So there's something really problematic about that evaluation slot that is so important, it's so hard for us to get away from. But I want to ask everybody to really think about, pay attention when you're teaching. Even if you could turn your phone on and record a snippet of a discussion, you'll sort of you'll be able to see what happens in that third turn. And so all of the productive talk work has actually focused on alternatives to that standard, teacher asks a question, student says something, usually it's pretty short, and the teacher says, good, or, not quite, anybody else have an idea, or, I love that, yes, exactly, you guys are so smart, that kind of positive is problematic also. So all of the productive talk moves that are laid out in Ready, Set, Science, and we've actually done some more work on that. So we're now organizing it in terms of goals or challenges that teachers have. So one challenge is that nobody's talking. And so you can use moves like, okay, I'm not getting much from you guys. Let's turn to the person next to you and talk to that person about this question. So the first thing is the question has to be relatively rich. If it's just, what's the biggest number on the graph, you're not going to get much to talk about. So teachers in this work are going to have to think hard about their initiating questions. But the productive talk focuses not so much on the initiating questions that you can sort of plan for, and then sometimes you have to redirect or you have to shift a bit. Those are important and tricky, but it's the follow-up. So after the kid says something that will make all the difference in the world. And so if kids aren't talking, you can say, let's take some think time. Or you can say things, if somebody says something very short, you can say, can you say more about that? Or can you give an example? Or I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding you. Are you saying, this is the revoicing move. So there are a bunch of moves that can help you just get the kids to go public with their own reasoning. And then the second challenge or goal, and I personally think this is the most underdeveloped goal challenge that we see in all of the classrooms. And that is that you've got to get kids to listen to each other. And so there are moves that can help you. When a kid says something, especially if it's somewhat complex, you can say, does anybody think they understand and can put that idea in their own words? And this works even with preschool kids. And kids will, again, you're not using it the way it's typically used. If ever you weren't listening, what did he just say? Do not use it that way. Don't do that. But who thinks they could repeat what he just said? Or who thinks they understand? Or wow, that was interesting or complicated. Does anyone think they understand? So try to find somebody who thinks they do understand and give it a go. And if they can't say it, if they say, oh, no, I didn't get it, or I didn't hear it, then you've got to ask them to have that person repeat it, which takes some time, but the person will always repeat it. Often they'll elaborate, so you'll actually get more. And then you go back and say, can you put that into your own words? And then you go back to the kid and say, was that what you were trying to say? And often the kids will say, no, not quite. What I meant was, and elaborate more. So that who can repeat or rephrase move, I think, is the most culture transforming move of all. And very few teachers use it. It's an awkward move. And not everybody is comfortable, especially with middle and high school kids. But you can say, I'm not sure I completely understand. Can anybody who thinks they understand put that into their own words? I mean, you have to play and get it to come out of your mouth so it feels okay. But that move is something everyone should play with. And you can even tell the kids, I'm going to be asking you guys to do that because it's really important that you listen and understand. And if you can't hear what somebody said, you got to ask them to repeat it. And you can practice, So that whole set of moves and goals. And another one that's sort of related to that is, so I'm not sure I completely understood what you were saying. Are you saying da-da-da-da-da-da-da? Not just repeating what the kid says, but actually asking them if that's what they meant. And kids as young as first graders will say, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was, so you don't have to feel like you're putting words in their mouths, but you have to authentically be trying to capture what you think they are saying, right or wrong. Use revoicing for an incorrect or a partially correct idea as well, not just for kids. I'm sorry, I'm going to open my door for my dog. Come on.
You know, while she does that, I'm going to go ahead and share this document too that talks about some of these goals and some of the moves that she's bringing up, so you can pull it up and take a look at it as well. So I'll share that in the chat box.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the next set of goals and challenges is getting kids to really dig deeper into their models, into their evidence, into their positions, their claims. And those moves actually teachers do use a lot. But those are the, why do you think that? Or where do you see evidence for that? Or where in the data do you see it, this pattern? And lots of the cross-cutting concepts can be, so that's interesting. Do you think that, pressing people for going deeper, focusing on a part of what they've said, on data that the class shares, on a cross-cutting concept, that whole set of moves, press for reasoning, is key. Again, remember, these are follow-up moves. These are completely in the moment, improvisational, and they are based on what has just been said. So these aren't the moves you can plan in advance and get a good question on the table, but they're totally in the moment. And then the last set of goals, challenges, is getting the kids to actually build on each other's thinking. And those are the moves like, okay, sounds like we have two interesting different ideas on the table. What do you guys think about that? Or do you agree or disagree with what Jamal just said? And why? Not just thumbs up if you agree, but do you agree or disagree and why? And those will really, I think, if you can get the kids to go public with their own ideas, and if you can get them to listen, then you really will start to see, and these are all third turn moves, you'll see none of them evaluate what the kid has just said. So to go back to Jesse's questions, how can you get started? Start with the say more move, which probably everybody already does, or revoicing. So, let me make sure I'm understanding you. Are you saying da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and check back with them. Don't just move on. So you're saying da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, who else? Check back with them, because that telegraphs to the kids that you actually are interested in what they have to say. And with English learners, the who can put this idea into their own words is great to use so that English learners repeat what other kids, native speakers say, but also that if they have an idea, you work really hard to give it some sense. You either revoice it, so are you saying da-da-da-da-da-da-da, or does anyone think they might understand what she means and can put it in their own words? So those moves are the very first. You can take them in tomorrow morning. And, the easiest ones to get started with are probably the revoicing move. So are you saying, and it's got to be an authentic, where you really want to know if that's exactly what the kid was trying to say. But they all shift the position of kids from getters of the answer you have in your head to actually thinkers, reasoners, holders of positions. And that will shift the culture in very fundamental ways. I don't want to say it's a silver bullet, because you have to have coherent content and good materials and, everything else you need. I guess I want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to stop talking, and we can sort of ask questions about this third turn transformative spot you guys have. I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, let's just, that we talk a lot about how do I engage my kids in the practices. And to some extent, this is new from Ready, Set, Science. although I think, as Heidi talked about, it was very much in the mix of everything we were writing about in that book. But I think that talk is the sea that everything floats on. James Britton, an ELA guru, British guy, said learning is always floated on a sea of talk. And so if you can work on this, opening up the conversation, getting kids to listen to each other, dig deeper, build on each other's thinking, you will actually be doing that with all of the practices. Every single one of the practices has to be kind of carried through talk. So this isn't an add-on. This is something you do to make every small group, I mean, the small group stuff is much trickier because you're not there, but you can have talk stems that the kids can try. I agree with so-and-so because, or I didn't understand what you said. Could you explain? You know, the kids themselves will take on these moves. Can you say more about that? It's interesting, but it does happen. I've seen it in very, very early elementary classrooms. So in everything you do, from a sort of circle time, eliciting ideas, to let's talk about our models that we've all come up with, student presentations, somebody goes to the front of the class and then there's a discussion afterwards. In all of that, you're going to be engaging the kids in productive practices. So that's my speech on that. I would really love to get some people now to talk back. What have you experienced with this talk stuff, and what have you done with the moves? What's tricky? So let's again give people some time to post or just raise, just unmute yourself and take a turn. What side?
Hello, I can go ahead and start, I guess. One of the things that I used to do, I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I used to do a lot of the encouraging students to listen to each other, and I would do a lot of the, hey, who can paraphrase or who can put this in their own words? And so that definitely takes some practice to get your students used to doing that. And you inevitably have students who maybe they miss the mark, or maybe they don't really get it, or maybe when you're like, hey, do you think you could try to paraphrase what so-and-so just said, they were kind of like, I wasn't listening. Because I think that students are kind of, I guess they're maybe trained to not ever listen to each other. You know? They only listen to the teacher. So something that I would do to help that is I would say, that's okay, no problem. And then I would say, who else thinks they might be able to paraphrase? Okay, awesome. Okay, who can say that in another way? And then I would ask another person. But before doing that, I would maybe tell the student that wasn't able to do it, like, hey, I'm going to have a couple other kiddos chime in. I'm going to have them paraphrase, and then I'm going to come back to you in a little bit. And so it's not so much that like, oh, I gotcha, like you were talking about. It's not like I'm going to punish you because you weren't listening and I caught you, daydreaming or something like that. It's more like, hey, if you don't get it now, that's okay. Let's have a couple other kids, and then I'm going to come back to you. And I think that it's helpful, number one, for students to have some of that repetition and to hear that idea, but also to put it in, you can have one idea that's phrased many different ways. And I think that helps students as well to hear it and think about the same thing and find out, like, how else can I say this? How else can I say this? And it helps them think about the idea a little bit more, or maybe a way that one kid says the same idea might stick with somebody more than another student.
Yeah, so I think there are a bunch of things that you're saying that are really, really important. Getting multiple kids to repeat or put it into their own words is hugely language acquisition facilitative. So that's one of the best things you can do with English learners, is letting them hear different sort of ways of talking about the same idea. And the other thing that I have actually found is when somebody wasn't listening, to make that totally not a, just say, ask them to say it again. And usually what you're doing is the kid is going to elaborate or say it in a maybe more confident way. And that really builds kids' muscles for doing the hard work of explaining your thinking. So even when the kid has to repeat it because somebody wasn't able to hear, classrooms are complicated. But even if they just were tuned out, okay, so now they're listening. The kid who originated the idea, usually, I've looked carefully at transcripts of this, the kids usually expands. And so you actually then have more to work with. And then going back, just like you said, to the kid and getting them to give it a try. Sometimes it takes it is slow, but you're building a kind of communicative stamina that is so, you'll see it will pay off. Things will go faster when there's a culture where everyone is on notice that they have to listen and understand. Because once you're tuned out, you can't benefit from the ideas that anybody is going public with. So yeah, you're one of those people that I've learned this from. But it's hard for a lot of teachers. I'm curious if anyone in our group has not used that move and could talk a little bit about what they think about it. And actually, Bridget, I know Bridget's got kids in the background and stuff, but Bridget, could you talk a little bit about having the students think of models as a public thinking space?
Sure. I hope it doesn't go off the rails back here behind me while I'm talking and everybody can hear. But in my room, we do a lot of modeling to, represent our findings on cause and effect and patterns and various other cross-cutting concepts. And we've started really thinking about those models more as our group's public thinking space, because not everybody that winds up working together is of the same mindset. So they're reluctant to put pen to paper or marker to paper, even worse, if it's like, okay, so this is your final copy here. So, we'll start with ugly paper, and they're much more apt to put things on paper, and then those talk moves kind of just organically happen because someone will put something on the paper and then another student in the group will say, well, I'm not really sure what you mean by this. Can you explain this a little bit more to me so I understand? Or they'll say, oh, I really like that idea. How about we add this to it? Yeah. So it kind of just happens with some sections. Other sections, it takes a little more work and pushing and establishing norms with them and really keeping those expectations clear, but that's been my experience. And I've been working on NGSS implementation for the past 3 years in my classroom.
I think one of the big things with NGSS is this emphasis on modeling as a way of, in a sense, explaining your current best mechanistic thinking. And so modeling and explaining are very linked practices. And so if you can start with, and I love the way you talk about kind of low stakes writing, this is not the final model, the class model. It can be ugly, it can be a rough draft. I think, but you have to somehow, in making your thinking public, you have to sort of explain what you're doing here. And so it naturally supports, here's what I'm showing in my model. And then, again, all of those third turn moves, what do the rest of you think? Do you agree or disagree? Or who can, all of them are just, like you say, they're natural. you're not saying good, yes, sorry, not quite, who wants to show their model? You know what I'm saying? It's a total setup for you to do this, expanding the conversation, talking for understanding and listening for understanding. And I think of talk as first draft talk also. We got to get the kids comfortable with, I wouldn't call it ugly talk, but I would call it just thinking on your feet. And it isn't about being right. It's about all of us being able to think with you and hear it. And yeah, we're gonna figure out and improve our ideas. But it isn't about right, wrong. It's about really helping the group with each other's ideas. So I love the way what you're doing there is you're talking about certain activity types that can actually help you support productive talk. And I think modeling and sharing our models and gallery walks and, you know, all of that, because you got to have shared stuff to talk about. And getting people on the same page, that's why the other big shift within GSS, aside from the practices, is this focus on phenomena. And that too brings common stuff into the classroom. It's not about who's had more experience with this concept and been to science museums or summer robotic camps or whatever. It's about what are we puzzled by with this phenomenon? And that the same kind of thing, thinking through the phenomenon. Some people talk about it as an anchoring phenomenon routine, where everybody gets to think about their best current explanation and model. Those are ugly and very hard to interpret. But everybody can also think about, what does that remind me of? And so everyone can bring in their own experiences similar, related to that phenomenon. And so everyone's world and life world can be in the conversation. And then the question is, so what questions do we still have? Because when they lay out their initial models or thinking, they're going to not have the answers. And so that's another kind of, I love the modeling, what did you call it? Models as a public thinking space. I think that's just brilliant. And I think the anchoring phenomenon and how you work that to create either a driving question board or sharing things that are related in our lives to coming up with a question we want to pursue now together. It's our class question, I think, gets more people on the same page in a way that will help you do more of this pressing for listening, deepening, working with cross-cutting concepts relevant to what we're doing right now, and then thinking, building on, improving, critiquing each other's thinking. So is anybody else in the conversation who could talk about anything else in the chapter about sort of actually doing this making thinking visible work, which I think of as, again, underlyingly about opening up the conversation, getting productive talk and listening happening? Who else could bring up something they'd like to pursue?
I wanted to point out the symmetry between these talk moves and what's going on in math. So in math, we want to facilitate discourse. We want the students to do the talking. And we want them to be comparing solutions and determining which solution is the most correct. We want them to compare solution strategies and identify how the mathematical reasoning are connected across these different pathways. So it's all of these rich conversations that stem from this discourse is shifting that cognitive load from the teacher to the student. So it's the same thing is happening in the science classroom, right? Like it's the students are the ones that are doing all the work. In that teacher-centric classroom, the teacher's doing all the thinking, and they're just pouring that information out on the student. So I don't know, I love the fact that this transcends all subject areas.
Yeah, that's a fantastic and really important point. And I think for elementary teachers, I'd love to know if you're an elementary teacher, just say so in the chat, because they are teaching everything. And what Janine just said is absolutely true. Okay, so these talk moves were actually developed collaboratively with my closest colleague, Kathy O'Connor, who works on Math Talk. And it turns out that they are also fundamentally useful in talking about history, social studies, current events, and ELA. So think about it. You got to get your kids to go public with their own thinking. So if it's in a math class, you've got to get them to explicate their solution path or their reason for doing X, Y, or Z. You got to get kids to listen to each other, or it's not a discussion. And only the good talkers or the kid who is starting it and is talking to the teacher is going to benefit. You got to get kids to dig deeper. Think about this in ELA. Think about it in social studies. And you've got to get kids to build on, agree with, critique each other. So these talk moves are not science-centric. They're absolutely critical to the particular kinds of practices that are fundamental to science: modeling, argument with evidence, designing investigations, asking questions. But they're really relevant for any kind of talk in any subject domain that you want to promote learning. So yes, you're right. We have to start thinking about, what does this look like when I try to do it right with different math solutions? Or what does it look like when I try to do it with a piece of evidence in a literary text in light of an interpretation? What do you think about that idea? Do you agree or disagree? And why? Where do you see evidence for that claim in the text? Close readings of any sort support claims and sort of reasoning behind how you link the claim to the evidence. So somebody was once talking about these talk moves in a very big conference in Washington at NSF, and how this is fundamental to how people work and make sense together. And about 3 months later, one of the participants in this huge conference wrote to, it was Kathy O'Connor, my colleague, and said, you know, that revoicing move has really improved my dating life. So yes, they're fundamental to science, but they really do work to open up a conversation so that people can build meaning together. So I'd be really curious how we can connect with colleagues who are math teachers or social studies teachers or ELA teachers around these same kind of goals and challenges. You got to get kids to go public. You got to get kids to listen. You got to get them to dig deeper. And you got to get them to build on, attend to, and critique each other's thinking. Do you have something you want to share? Alexandra, maybe? Any more? Anybody else want to comment on either the talk in particular or something else in the chapter?
This wasn't necessarily in the chapter, but just something that I thought of as you were talking is how important it is for teachers to be asking the right questions. And I was kind of thinking in my head, I was like, how can we, like, what criteria could we use to know, like, this is the type of question that I should be asking, versus like how I feel like that might be a good way to start to shift, is like, here are the types of questions that I should be asking. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about types of questions that foster these types of conversations in kids.
So that's a part of, it's in my notes here as well. So that's a really, really, really important thing. A lot of times teachers are told to really work on their questions. That's the key. And ask higher order questions, high cognitive demand questions, or ask open-ended questions, or ask authentic questions, like questions you actually don't know the answer to, which is really just not helpful. You can't teach science or math and not have answers to a lot of the questions you ask. And they're asked to ask authentic questions. And I think that that's not super helpful. If you want to launch a discussion, you can plan, you can think in advance about what's a discussable question. So that might be, Jesse, what you're talking about. What is a discussable question that can open things up so that kids can go public and dig deeper? Okay. And those kinds of questions are really important and tricky, because for a question to be discussable, you want there to be more than one obvious right answer that the kids who are quick on their feet can raise their hands and say, and you can say, good, yes. So a discussable question has to actually allow for divergence. It has to be a question that is going to spark more so this is why the math people are lucky, because the kinds of sort of structures they use, where you'd have multiple solution paths. Either kids work as groups and come up with a solution, or they work on their own and share out. But you've automatically got a question that's going to have multiple perspectives, multiple ideas. And so there's actually a really good tool that I'll send to Jesse, and we can make this part of the resources, called Planning for a Key Discussion, or basically planning for a discussion. It can be a 5-minute discussion, or a 10-minute discussion, or 30 minutes. So it's a tool that helps you anticipate what kids might say and actually think about where would you like them to get by the end of this short conversation. And you actually can think through, I would like somebody in the group to say that, be able to say this. It forces you to think through, is this a good question or not? So you can do very good planning for these discussable questions. And teachers find that this tool, you don't have to use it all the time, but that it's incredibly helpful to make sure you've got a good discussable question. You're much more prepared because you know what you think kids will say. You're often surprised, which is also interesting. But you also know what you're hoping that the discussion will lead to. And it doesn't always. Sometimes it takes 2 days to get, but it gives you a sense of what are you going towards. And then you get into the habit of thinking through your questions a bit so that they're much more reliably going to get you where you want to go. Okay, so that's one thing. That's the kind of question that you have control over. You know you're going to set things up for this. You know you want to get to a place where you can raise this question. And that may not be specific enough to sort of give you the answer, but you have to be working, the initiation type have to be discussable kinds of questions to get you out of that IRE. But then the follow-up questions you don't have to plan for. Those are in the moment. And if you've got, some people use a productive talk moves. That I sent this to you and you can send it out. It's a checklist of 9 awesome moves oriented to those 4 goals of getting kids to go public, listening, digging deeper, thinking with others. So you don't have to, what you have to do is be present and have some tricks in your back pocket, like nobody's talking. So ask a good question and then say, partner talk, or take a moment to stop and jot. And then you'll have more to draw on. You can rove around and see what kids are thinking, and you can bring out quiet kids and say, just read what you wrote, or I heard something really interesting in your partnership. Tell us what, blah, blah, blah. Or who can say what their partner said. I mean, there are lots of very easy tricks, talk moves that you can use in the moment. But the idea that you can just toss a question off, that you will be helped in these, what I call discussions, if you've taken a little bit of time to think through, do I have a good discussable question that is in the service of the learning goals that I really want to get to today or over days or in this unit? Does that help at all? I mean, they're really separate issues. The framing question versus the follow-up moves. And sometimes curricula will help. They will actually have suggestions. This is an eliciting ideas discussion, or this is a data interpretation discussion, and you can often be helped by the curriculum, but often if you don't have really good NGSS designed, aligned curricula, you're often more on your own. So come on, guys. I know. Oh, well, I can tell you, Jesse and I were thinking that we wanted to start with the hallmarks of productive talk. These are like, it's working when you see these things. And so I'm going to just tell, I think we have this as a handout also, but.
I'll share it.
Okay, you share it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe somebody who hasn't spoken could actually read it.
I hope that's the right link.
So I'm going to just quickly say them, but people, if you would like to challenge or problematize or push. So one is that everyone can hear and understand what's being said, so that every single student is part of the conversation. This is the least developed part of most classroom cultures. Every single kid has to be able to hear and understand. And so if we took that really seriously, we would do a lot of things differently. I mean, we'd set norms that really focus on that. Every single kid has to hear. And we'd work it. So you get a lot of bang for the buck by stressing that if somebody didn't hear it or doesn't understand, they've got to speak up. You'll know you've begun to set this culture when some kid says, I don't really understand what that means. And if an English learner can say, I don't understand, I don't know that word, then you should email me and say, Yes. I mean, it's like that is the hallmark of a culture for talking for understanding. So the second thing is that the conversation is focused, coherent, rigorous, and leads to deep conceptual understanding. And that's the tricky thing. How do you keep it focused? How do you keep it coherent? And part of that is in the framing questions. You know, in addition to the follow-up talk moves, teachers have to get better at doing a kind of navigation moves. Like, what did we do yesterday? What did we figure out yesterday? If kids can't articulate that, you know there was something that didn't happen at the end of yesterday. That kind of move, who can kind of characterize what we did and what we sort of figured out yesterday as a starting move? And then, you know, you can ask things like, so what have we come to? Like, who can summarize what we think this conversation, that this discussion got us to see? Or, so it seems like, who can summarize what we figured out as a class? That's an incredibly important move towards the end of the session. And what questions do we still have? If the kids can get used to knowing where they've been, how does what we figured out today relate to our driving question or the phenomenon? How does what we figured out today actually relate to the phenomenon we're trying to explain? So those kinds of questions. Or how does what we're talking about relate to patterns? So you can use the cross-cutting concepts as lenses, and you can get kids to summarize and have ideas about. So those kinds of questions can keep the conversation focused and coherent, so that every kid knows why they're doing what they're doing, how it relates to what we did before, and how we're going to figure out what we still don't understand. And so getting the kids to kind of own a bit more what they're doing and where they're going is a part of keeping things focused and coherent. And then you've got to get kids motivated. You have to get kids to feel like they have a stake in the conversation. And that's where the notion of the bringing our models together as a space for making thinking visible. If kids are talking about their own ideas, and if somebody disagrees, they are incredibly motivated to figure this out. So really managing motivation, or there's a stake in the conversation for each of us, that's a tremendously challenging but important part. And I think, again, bringing kids' own models, their lived experience as it relates to this, are all ways, and I think fostering disagreement are all ways that kids will come. So wrong answers are not to be run away from. Wrong answers are golden because we can all think with them and unpack them. If we don't understand why a wrong answer is wrong, this is totally true in math. You can't ever really know why the right answer, if you thought something was wrong, but you don't deeply understand why it was wrong, you can't fully take on a revision to that thinking. And then conversation is not just for the good talkers. We really have to build for more equitable participation. And some of that can be with think time. If you give kids more time to partner talk or to stop and jot, you don't have to call on, you can use wait time. People have found that's the single most important talk move. Zip it and count to 3 really slowly. and look down, go like, don't look at the kids, just go, wow. And then you can resort to a partner talk if need be. But then you get the less kind of shoot from the hip, I'm smart, I want to talk, I know this. You get more kids who are typically reluctant or don't fully control English to talk. So those are, and then the teacher guides students in practicing new ways of talking, reasoning, and collaborating. So you can model. So let me see if I could put what you're trying to say in sort of really scientific terms. What do you think about if we said this? Who can put that? Who can rephrase that? So there are ways that you can seed models of how you say what somebody else has said in a slightly more disciplined or using vocabulary. The other thing is people often want to pre-teach vocabulary. I think you should build kids' understandings and then teach the vocabulary, the scientific vocabulary. Or you can say to the kids, what should we call this? We've come up with this notion of frequency. What should we call it? Then you can say, scientists, when they talk about this very same thing, they call it frequency or amplitude. I think teaching in advance a term that has a concept behind it should grow out of kids' understanding rather than precede it. That's going to be a big challenge, especially for teachers who have ESL kids, because they think they can't be in the conversation if they don't have the science vocabulary. I would say help them get in the conversation with everyday language. And when they've got an idea that is something that we could all use, we can all use this term. If everybody understands it, this is how we can use that term. That turns out to be a much more powerful way of getting kids to talk and understand, talk science and talk scientific vocabulary-wise. So I don't know if that's helpful, Jesse, or if...
It's very helpful. And I hate to end this because I think you're giving everybody so many things to think about and things to take back to their classroom. But we have to end eventually at some point. So I can think of a million questions that I have now that I didn't have before, which is great. So we'll think about ways to continue this conversation and to tap into you and each other as resources as well to kind of move towards this vision of using all these tools along with our science and engineering practices to create classrooms where knowledge is being constructed, that we're figuring things out together and using ourselves to do that. So thank you for helping us kind of along that journey, no matter where we are in our classroom. So thank you so much for joining us.
Can I just say one last thing?
Absolutely.
Thank you all. And I would be so happy if anybody wanted to email me or keep this conversation alive in some way. But one of the things we didn't talk about is the importance of building a culture, establishing norms. And I think you guys are going to have a conversation focusing on that in the future. So I applaud you, because without that, it's hard to get this kind of talk stuff to happen. So thank you all very, very much.
And we have a whole bunch of resources too that we will send out an email form and post on the website as well, along with the video. So you'll have access to those. Kind of a few things before we go. Janine, do you want to post put in the chat box the post survey information? There it is. It just
nope, that's not that is the registration for Thursday. If anybody wanted to participate in that conversation we're going to have on establishing that positive classroom culture. But here is the link to the post survey. There you go. You want to wave, Luke?
Yeah.
I love it. I'm so glad Luke is here. So there's the post survey. Okay.
Yeah, so the post survey's there, and like Janine said, Thursday, so quick turnaround because it's a combined with math and social science, but focusing on our positive classroom culture from a classroom teacher who we know is really great at this. So she is pretty inspiring to hear speak about how she sets this up in her classroom. We will also share in the chat window a link to our resources at scienceteachersinaction.org. If you didn't hear from about these sessions from our listserv, there is a link to sign up for our listserv as well to get kind of the latest and greatest of the resources that we provide and other resources that we have found helpful. Also follow us on Twitter and Facebook to kind of get those same updates and up-to-date information. So thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Bye.